In 2014, the United States Centers for Disease Control published a study ranking the nutrient density of 47 fruits and vegetables. One plant scored a perfect 100 out of 100. Not kale, not spinach, not blueberries. A small, peppery green that grows in shallow, moving water. A plant that was eaten daily by ancient Greeks, cultivated by medieval monks, sold by the bundle on Victorian street corners, and considered essential food by the urban poor of 19th century London. Then, within a single generation, it vanished from the American diet. Not because it became less nutritious, but because the water it grew in became poisonous, and the memory of what it had meant to need it became something people wanted to forget. This is an aquatic plant. It grows in streams, in springs, in ditches where clean water flows continuously. The stems are hollow, buoyant, floating on the surface or creeping along wet soil. The leaves are small, dark green, rounded, growing in clusters along the stem. The flavor is sharp, peppery, slightly bitter, a heat similar to mustard or horseradish, but milder, fresher. It is eaten raw. It does not need cooking, though it can be cooked. For most of human history, it was simply gathered, rinsed, and consumed. The plant has been eaten for at least 2,000 years, likely much longer. The ancient Greeks knew it. The Romans cultivated it. Pliny the Elder wrote about it. Dioscorides, the Greek physician whose botanical texts shaped European medicine for 15 centuries, recorded its use. It was considered both food and remedy, though the line between those categories was not as firm then as it would later become. There is a tradition, though it may be apocryphal, that Hippocrates built his first hospital on the island of Kos, near a stream specifically so he could grow this plant for his patients. Whether true or not, the story reflects how the plant was perceived. Essential, restorative, tied to health in ways that went beyond simple nutrition. The Romans ate it regularly, often as a salad, sometimes combined with vinegar and oil. They believed it sharpened the mind. Roman soldiers carried it on campaigns. It grew easily, required no cultivation, and could be harvested from almost any clean stream. In a pre-refrigeration world, where fresh greens were seasonal and scarce, a plant that grew year-round in water was valuable. By the medieval period, monasteries across Europe were cultivating this plant in controlled water gardens. Monks understood that it needed flowing water to thrive, and they built channels and sluices to maintain the proper conditions. The plant was eaten during Lent, when meat was forbidden. It was one of the few fresh greens available in winter and early spring, when gardens were barren and stored vegetables were depleted. In England, the plant became deeply embedded in the diet of the working class. By the 18th and 19th centuries, it was a common sight in London markets. Street vendors, often young girls, sold it in bunches for a penny. It was called poor man's bread in some regions. It was breakfast. Workers bought it on their way to factories, ate it with bread, sometimes with a bit of salt. It was cheap, abundant, and filling in the way that fresh, peppery greens can be filling when there is little else. The plant grew wild in the streams and rivers around London, and it was also cultivated in watercress beds, shallow, flooded fields fed by springs or diverted streams. These beds were labor-intensive but productive. The plant grew quickly. It could be harvested repeatedly, cut back and allowed to regrow. In the right conditions, it produced year-round. But the water mattered. The plant had to grow in clean, flowing water. Stagnant water killed it. Polluted water poisoned it. And as the Industrial Revolution progressed, the water changed. By the mid-19th century, rivers and streams across England were becoming contaminated. Factory waste, human sewage, agricultural runoff, all of it flowed into the waterways where this plant grew. The plant itself absorbed whatever was in the water. It bioaccumulated pollutants, heavy metals, pathogens, and people kept eating it. Typhoid outbreaks were traced to this plant. Cholera, in some cases as well. The plant grew in water contaminated with human waste, and when consumed raw, it transmitted disease. The connection was not always understood immediately, but by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, public health authorities began warning against it. In some areas, wild harvesting was banned. In others, it was simply avoided. The cultural association shifted. the plant that had been food became dangerous. It was no longer a symbol of resourcefulness or sustenance. It was a symbol of poverty, of desperation, of the diseases that killed the urban poor. When people had the money to buy other greens, they did. When they had access to foods that did not carry the risk of typhoid, they chose those instead. At the same time, agricultural systems were changing. Lettuce, particularly iceberg lettuce, was being bred for durability and shelf life. It could be grown far from cities, harvested, packed in ice, and shipped by rail. It arrived crisp, clean, safe. It had no strong flavor, no peppery bite, nothing that required an acquired taste. It was neutral, inoffensive, and critically, it did not grow in water that might be contaminated. This aquatic plant could not compete with that. It required clean water, which was increasingly scarce near urban centers. It wilted within days of harvest, sometimes within hours if not kept cool and moist. It could not be shipped long distances. It had to be sold locally, quickly, and it had to be trusted. But trust had been broken. By the mid-20th century, consumption had collapsed in the United States. The plant was still grown commercially in a few places, parts of England, parts of France, a few farms in the United States. But it was niche, marginal, remembered mostly by older generations or by immigrants from countries where it had never fully disappeared. The plant did not fail. It did not become less nutritious. It did not lose its ability to grow quickly, to produce year-round, to thrive in conditions where other greens would not. What failed was the water, and what followed was a cultural rejection so complete that an entire food tradition nearly vanished. In the late 20th century, nutritional scientists began systematically analyzing the nutrient content of common foods, comparing them in standardized ways. This plant appeared in those studies. The results were striking. Per 100 grams, the plant contains more vitamin K than almost any other food, more than kale, more than spinach. It contains more calcium per calorie than milk. It contains more iron than spinach, more vitamin C than oranges, more vitamin A than carrots. It is dense with folate, iodine, manganese, and omega-3 fatty acids in the form of alpha-linolenic acid. But the most notable finding came in 2014, when researchers at the Centers for Disease Control created a classification system for powerhouse fruits and vegetables, defined as foods that provide, on average, at least 10% of the daily value of 17 nutrients considered essential for reducing chronic disease risk. 47 foods qualified. They were ranked by nutrient density scores. This plant scored 100 out of 100. It was the only food to receive a perfect score. Kale scored 49. Spinach scored 86. Collard greens scored 62. Romaine lettuce scored 63. This plant doubled the score of kale. And yet, in the decades since that study was published, it has remained largely unknown to most Americans. Part of the reason is biological. The plant contains compounds called glucosinolates, which break down into isothiocyanates when the plant is chewed or cut. These compounds are responsible for the peppery flavor, and they have been studied extensively for their potential biological activity, particularly a compound called Phenethyl isothiocyanate, or PEITC. The mechanisms are not fully understood, but the compound has been observed in laboratory and animal studies to interfere with certain cellular processes. The plant also contains small amounts of naturally occurring toxins, as many plants do, but these are not present in quantities that pose risk under normal consumption. The real danger was never the plant itself. It was the water. From an agricultural perspective, this plant offers something unusual: perennial, year-round production in climates where water does not freeze. The plant is a perennial. It does not die after a season. If left in place, if the water continues to flow, it simply keeps growing. Harvesting does not kill it. Cut stems placed in water will root within days and can be transplanted. A single planting can produce for years. The plant grows fast. In optimal conditions, cool, clean, flowing water, partial shade, temperatures between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, it can be ready to harvest in as little as 3 weeks from planting. It can be harvested repeatedly, cut back to the base, and it regrows. It tolerates poor soil. In fact, it does not need soil at all. It can be grown hydroponically, in containers, in any system where its roots have access to water and its stems have access to air. Home gardeners have grown it in buckets with aquarium pumps to circulate the water. It has been grown in trays that are flooded and drained daily. It has been grown in streams, in ponds, in drainage ditches. The critical requirement is clean water. If the water is contaminated, the plant absorbs the contamination. If the water is stagnant, the plant rots. But if the water is clean and moving, the plant thrives. This is both its strength and its vulnerability. In a world where clean water is scarce, where streams and rivers are polluted, where urban waterways carry runoff from roads and industry, growing this plant is not simple. It requires either access to a clean water source or the ability to create one artificially. It requires vigilance. It requires understanding that the plant is only as safe as the water it grows in. For commercial growers, this has always been the challenge. Maintaining water quality at scale is expensive. Certification, testing, liability. These are costs that do not apply to lettuce grown in soil, and consumers, once they have been taught to associate a food with disease, do not easily forget. So the plant remains marginal. It is sold in some farmers' markets, in some specialty grocery stores. It appears on the menus of upscale restaurants, where chefs value its flavor and nutritional density. It is grown by hobbyists, by people interested in aquaponics or hydroponics, by immigrants from cultures where it never stopped being eaten. But it is not common. It is not cheap. It is not what most people think of when they think of salad greens. And that is a loss, not just nutritionally, but culturally. Because this plant represents a way of eating that was once widespread, a way of interacting with the landscape that required knowing where clean water was, that required understanding seasons and cycles, that required recognizing food in places that were not fields or gardens, but streams and springs. The plant has a name. It is called watercress. It is easy to recognize once you know what to look for. The small, rounded leaves, the hollow stems, the clusters of tiny white flowers, four-petaled, that appear in late spring and summer. The sharp, peppery taste. If you find it growing wild, do not eat it unless you are certain the water is clean. Watercress growing in streams can harbor parasites, particularly liver flukes, which require an intermediate host but can be present in the plant tissue. Wild watercress is safest when cooked, though cooking destroys some of the nutrients and all of the crisp texture. Cultivated watercress, grown in controlled conditions, is different. It is sold in bunches, with roots still attached in some cases, the stems crisp and green. It wilts quickly. Buy it fresh, use it within a day or two. Store it in the refrigerator with the stems in water, like cut flowers. To grow it at home, start with cuttings or seeds. Cuttings are faster. Place them in a container of water. Clean, dechlorinated water if possible. Change the water daily or use a small pump to keep it circulating. The cuttings will root within a week. Once rooted, they can be transplanted to a larger container, to a hydroponic system, or to soil that is kept constantly wet. Some gardeners grow it in plastic tubs, refreshing the water every few days. Others grow it in trays with drainage, flooding them twice a day. The plant needs light, but not full sun. Partial shade is ideal. It needs cool water. In hot climates, it struggles unless the water is shaded and kept cool. It is a spring and fall crop in most regions, though in mild coastal climates, it can grow year-round. Watercress is not rare. It is not difficult to obtain. Seeds are available from specialty suppliers. Fresh bunches are sold in many cities. The knowledge of how to grow it, how to prepare it, how to recognize it, that knowledge exists. It has always existed. It was simply set aside, for reasons that made sense at the time, in a context that no longer exists. The water is cleaner now than it was a century ago. Not everywhere, but in many places. The Clean Water Act, passed in the United States in 1972, began the process of restoring rivers and streams that had been treated as sewers. It is not complete, but it is better, and the plant is still here, in streams, in springs, in the controlled beds of small farms, in the hydroponic gardens of hobbyists, in the coolers of grocery stores that cater to customers who remember or who have learned. what it is. Watercress did not fail. It was not replaced by something better. It was abandoned because the systems we built, industrial, urban, divorced from the landscape, could not accommodate a plant that required clean water, that wilted within hours, that tasted too strong, that carried memories of disease and poverty. But it is still here, waiting, as it has always waited, in the cold water of springs, in the margins of streams, in the knowledge held by people who never stopped growing it. The knowledge was always here. We just stopped looking.